Welcome to the Coping Podcast, where we share strategies for coping with the stressors of life, especially the difficulties of parenting. And here is your host, Dr. Lee Weiss.
This is Dr. Lee Weiss. I am the host of the Coping Podcast, where I feature top experts on topics like raising healthy children, parenting, and so much more. Past guests include therapist and researcher Dr. Eli Leibowitz, dietitian Laura Field, and many more. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided is for educational and informational purposes only. This is not intended to provide mental health treatment and does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. The information provided is not a replacement for being assessed and evaluated by a licensed professional and is not intended to replace mental health or medical advice. Before we get into today's topic, I wanted to introduce our guest, Suzanne Phillips-Keeley, who I've had the pleasure to work with when we have collaborated on cases in the past, where I was the therapist and she was doing the executive functioning tutoring for the same client. Suzanne Phillips-Keeley earned her undergraduate degrees in communication disorders and speech science and in psychology from the University of Colorado, and she received her master's degree in speech language pathology from Northwestern University. Suzanne is a licensed speech language pathologist with over 30 years of experience successfully treating those with executive function disorders and differences. She is the author of Write This Down, Making Your Student Planner Work for You, the source for executive function disorders, and she developed a unique tool to maximize executive function skills. Mm-hmm. Suzanne's innovative work has led her to be a frequent speaker at conferences, schools, and parent groups across the country, and her private practice is located near us in Wilmette, Illinois. So thank you so much, Suzanne, for taking the time to be here and share your expertise with us. We have spoken at length about your area, which is executive functioning, and I'm so glad that today you're going to share with our parent audience more about what this looks like in kids, in teens, and even adults, and really help us with what parents can do to support their kiddos. So to start, I'm going to ask you a real basic question, which is kind of to explain what executive functions even are.
Such an easy question and so hard to answer. Thank you. That was a really nice introduction. Good. I appreciate you asking me. So what are executive functions? They are very high-level brain skills, neurologic skills that allow us to anticipate what needs to be done, identify what the end result is going to be, how we're going to get to that end result with a plan and timing and strategies and who else is involved and all of that. Simultaneously, we're also taking in information from others in our environment and from ourselves about what's working and what isn't. It requires mental flexibility to change direction when something isn't going the way that it is, and to ultimately reach the goal that we were going for. So the goal can be something big and grandiose, like I want to be fluent in French, or it can be I need to clean the kitchen. So big and small, this executive function is kind of the view from 30,000 feet. It's not the little bitty tiny pieces. It's what's the big picture look like? What's the end result? And how am I going to get there?
Yes, there's so much more than I think people think of when they think of executive functions. And yet when people do not have, really well-developed executive functions, I think it's very obvious. And that's when we sort of notice it most.
Exactly. And when you say when it's developed, that's one of the key things. So the frontal lobes are the front part of the brain, and that's where executive functions are housed. Most parts of the brain have a pretty regular developmental sequence, and a lot of it is very early. So by the time, we're one, we can kind of get up on our two legs and start walking. By the time we're two, we're putting some sounds together so that we're talking. And we have all these developmental milestones, many of which are kind of reached by school age. Mm-hmm. And then we get another big burst around puberty where we get a whole bunch of new things. But this high-level executive skill, this higher-level cognitive thinking skill in the frontal lobes isn't fully developed until we're well into our 30s. And some research is even saying 40s,
Wow.
And we all know people in our 50s that you're like, we're still waiting for it to develop. So
Yeah.
that's one of the important things to remember, particularly when we're talking about kids, is that the expectation for developed executive functions for a 10-year-old, a middle schooler, even a college age kid should really be in the context that they're still developing.
Hmm. That makes
Another component to the development that is really interesting is that there's such a wide range of normal. Again, back to the analogies of early things, you and I walk basically the same. If you saw me walking and I limped, you would know that that was something different. With the exception of regional accents, we talk the same. Um, there's such a wide variety of normal executive function skills. You and I both know adults that you look at and you're like, how do they even have on matching shoes? You know, they are so disorganized, they're befuddled, they're late, they never have what they need. And yet they have a job, they have a family, they pay their bills, they are making it, they're doing just fine. It's not the same as I would do it, probably not the same as you would do it, but it works. So
Mhm.
when kids are learning how to develop these skills, the modeling that they get is all over the place. So they see these differences in adults too. And that probably doesn't help the speed with which things are developing because they see some excellent examples, then they see some poor examples, and yet these are all the adults in their world,
Mhm.
and they're getting by just fine.
I always think of like the professor, the brilliant professor example comes to mind. It's just an image,
Yes,
the books all over the desk and the papers scattered everywhere on the floor in piles, and yet that person knows like where things are somehow. Like it is
right,
fascinating. And then there's people where you come in, adults, and their desk is perfectly spotless
perfect.
because at the end of the day they have a system and they have places
Yes,
where they need to be. So it's fascinating to see like who loses their keys all the time and where and who has a system as adults. When I first sort of thought about executive functioning skills earlier in my career, I always paired it in my head with kids with ADHD, that the kids with ADHD seem to struggle, across the board with these skills. Obviously, as I've learned more and had more exposure, I know now that it's not just kids with ADHD who struggle with executive functions, but I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the different groups of people that you've helped besides kids with ADHD.
yeah, I think that's a common perception is that ADHD and executive functions go together, which they often do. But I've seen all sorts of kids who don't have an ADHD diagnosis and they've got executive function problems. I've seen kids who do have ADD diagnoses who really aren't doing that badly. So,
Mhm,
the executive function is kind of like the CEO of the brain,
mhm,
and the CEO can only make good decisions when it's getting accurate information. So, people with a diagnosis of any kind often have struggles with executive function because the lower level skills that are being fed up to the frontal lobes aren't accurate. So somebody with attention problems, what they're taking in is different than someone without. But the same goes if somebody has an auditory processing disorder or they're dyslexic. Any number of things that are baseline skills, if those aren't up to speed, the executive functions are making decisions on less than perfect information. So, like you, I really thought that the vast majority of the people that I work with would have a diagnosis of some fashion. And I found out that that's not nearly as many as I thought it would be.
mhm,
So, about a third of the people that I work with, from kids through adults, have a diagnosis, any kind of speech language, cognitive, behavioral anxiety, all that kind of stuff. Then there's another third that are gifted. They've been tested and identified as gifted. In whatever area that they're gifted in, they can do extraordinary work and intelligence wise, but they can't do the work involved. So I
mhm,
had one amazing child who was not even in middle school. I think it was still like fifth grade that was able to be doing high school math, high school calculus, complete genius in math, but couldn't do the high school level work, couldn't sit to do 30 minutes of homework,
Mhm.
because even though they were brilliant at the math, they didn't have the attention span to sit and do homework for 30 minutes.
Mhm.
Tests usually were an hour long. That was way too long to make a kid sit and take a test. So those executive function skills were what were bringing him down and making him not look gifted and not look as talented when in fact he really was if we just let him take the test in 15-minute hits and do half the homework. So a lot of gifted individuals, not just for geeky things like math, but artistic endeavors, they can operate well beyond their years, but they're still not beyond their years.
And even
And
just simple things like turning assignments in can cause,
exactly.
we were talking earlier about like college students who are failing out of classes, but who are, really gifted in engineering and math and things like that, but they need help with basic things like time management and deadlines and such.
Yeah. Kind of as a little sidelight with college age kids. If you stop and think about it, it's so ironic that we put school kids in school, sometimes preschool at age 3, all the way through 12 years in high school. And if they're really good at it and they have really good grades, we reward them by moving them to another level, which is taught and lived in a completely different method than everything that they did for those 15 years ahead of time. So college kids, not just freshmen, they
Mhm.
often struggle because the original environment isn't there, their support system isn't there. They suddenly have all this time. We always talk about college kids having difficulty with time management, but up until then, they had no time to manage. They
Right.
got up, they go to school, you go to your after school event, you come home, you eat dinner, you do your homework, you go to bed, you do that,
Repeat.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, wash, rinse, repeat. And suddenly they go to college and they may only have 2 classes a day, or they may have 0 classes on a day. They have no idea what the expectation for homework that you should be doing like 3 hours of homework for every hour you're in class. They have no idea of that. So they
Mhm.
have all this free time. They don't know what they're doing with it. They don't have their support systems. And to me, it's amazing when they actually do well because there's so many systems that aren't supporting it.
Right. And of course, the parents who tend to be the nags and the helpers, right, are
Right, right.
removed all of a sudden. So it's the same time where they really don't have other adults helping in the same way.
Exactly. And
Wow.
there's also this expectation or anticipation that these kids have that I'm an adult now, I should be able to handle this. And then there's the parents' expectation of, you know what, I want to give them their space and let them feel like they're independent. And so both sides realize they need to be asking each other for help, but they're hesitant to do so.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
So
It's
I've got the kids with the diagnoses, then I've got the kids that are gifted, and
Mhm.
then I've got just kids and adults that are just kids and adults. And they're if you tested them on things, nothing would come out abnormal,
Mhm.
but they just can't show what they know because they just don't have the development of those frontal lobes and that executive function strategy that works for them.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I was surprised that that took up as much space in my practice as it does.
Well, the good news is it sounds like more and more people are really starting to recognize that they do need
Yeah,
support and that they could
yeah,
benefit from it, even in the absence of a diagnosis or an official recommendation. Because
right,
again, being intelligent is only going to get you so far. The executive function
right.
piece is huge, huge.
There have been so many times that I will end up seeing the parents of the kids
Yeah, it
that the
happened with
kids were
with our
the
share
kids
cake.
are the yep, the kids are the first ones to come, and then
Mhm.
the parents are like, "Whoa, I don't do this either." And,
Mhm.
I think as I said to you, apple doesn't fall far from the tree. As parents, we love to brag about the skills that our kids got from us that are good, but they also get our bad habits too.
For
And
sure.
if the parents and the adults in the house don't have good time management, it's pretty obvious that the kids are not going to either.
Right. And systems in place. Yes.
Yeah.
Checklists, all kinds of ways that we keep ourselves organized, hopefully, or not.
Oh, or not. Right.
Tell us about a kiddo, maybe the elementary school age, kind of why they came in and what you helped them with. We're going to try to do this for, one elementary, we'll go one middle school, maybe one young adult or adult, just to get
Perfect.
a sense of the work.
So if we're thinking about elementary grammar school kids, most of the executive functions are controlled by the outsiders. They're as they should be.
Mhm.
Um, the goal is given to them. The steps are provided for them. Um, the sequence, the method, everything is given to them. The feedback is generally always positive. Good work, a sticker. It's not critiqued. It's
Mhm.
just you did it, and that's wonderful, and we're really happy, and we want you to do it again. So it's all very external.
Mhm.
How do you get that to become more internal? So it can happen just intuitively, but a lot of times it needs to be very, very direct. Um, as the adults, we have basically good executive function skills. It's hard for us to even imagine steps in the process that are so obvious to us. We would never even put them in. Like it would be like saying, well, once you put the food in your mouth, then you're supposed to swallow. We don't even include it. A lot of the elementary school kids that I see, they'll have an assignment, and the teacher has broken down the assignment quite well. I can almost always double the number of steps because they made too many assumptions about what the kid knows between step one and step two. There's actually step one, A, B, C, D. So, my mantra, particularly for the younger kids, is assume nothing, even for the older kids. Assume nothing. When somebody looks at you and says, duh, of course, then you can quit telling them. But
Mhm.
until then, you should assume that they don't know the steps. And I'm pretty good at figuring out the steps that are not included. But this one got me stumped. It was a girl who was in, I think, fourth grade. No, it must have been third grade because it was the ever and never ending third grade report on an animal, which, if you live around here, nobody does like a giraffe. Everybody does a skunk, a raccoon, or a rat. So it was the animal report, and she was doing skunks. And the teacher gave out the plan. I added steps to it. One of the instructions was you need 3 resources. 2 can be online, but you need to check a book out of the library. Perfect. So the girl does the research, she follows the steps, she puts together a fabulous report on skunks. It's actually an accelerated writer. It was really fabulous. I proofread it, her parents proofread it. We're like, this is really good. Turns it in, gets it back, and she got a B. And I was like, why was that? Because I certainly thought that it was a pretty good paper. So I said, let's look back over the rubric. And we looked at the rubric, and she met all of those standards. So I said, well, this is where we need to work on self advocacy. You need to go in and ask your teacher, why did I get a B? What can I do differently to get an A? Well, the teacher said, well, you didn't have a book. And then I was like, but you did. I saw the book. You did. She goes, yeah, I did. So I brought it into her, and I said, yeah, I have the book. She goes, but you didn't. It wasn't included in the paper. And she goes, well, you didn't say I had to read it.
Oh,
The instruction was you need to check a book out of the library.
oh my gosh.
That one flew past me. It would never have crossed my mind that you need to say, and
Eat it.
you need to read that book.
No, of course.
So that's like, that stuck with me forever because you think you've got all the steps and you really don't. So we can assume nothing at that age group.
Right, right. Unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I thought you were going to say something different, which
Mhm.
also could have been the case, which is that, she did this beautiful report and the morning of realized she was missing that book from the library, but the library
Right.
was closed or she didn't have time. And I feel like a lot of the kids that I work with too, again, like they don't even realize something till it's too late because they haven't planned
Right.
ahead or broken it up into chunks. So I think
Right.
my sense is like fourth grade gets a little bit more challenging with executive function, but
Hmm.
even younger kids, some of them really need that checklist to make sure their backpack is packed okay. What about
Right.
in terms of just like keeping track of belongings for the younger kids?
And when you give them all those checklists again, when they finally look at you and like, of course I've got my lunch, mom, and they actually do have their lunch, then you can take it off the list.
Yeah.
Um, you know, having things be very direct, make no assumptions, and make sure that your standard is the same as their standard. Packing your backpack doesn't mean things are hanging out and you can't zip it up and your lunch doesn't fit. Define exactly what a packed backpack looks like
Right.
and where does it go. I'm big on having everything have a home.
Yes.
When you're not using it, where is your backpack and what's in it? So it's just most of the time. Well, I always think this: very, very, very rarely are kids defiant or lazy,
Right.
which is what they often get accused of being. Very. I've had a few, but kids are not defiant and they're not lazy. They are really trying. And if they're not doing it, it's probably because we've missed telling them a step that seems so obvious to us
Yeah.
and it isn't to them.
No, and I've seen kids who, again, same age, young kids who seem to do all of this super naturally without needing these lists or checklists or homes. That it's like in their brain, they're just doing it in a way that is simple for them. And other kids who, yeah, they cannot find their sports equipment. They can't, and they
Yep.
really need us to break it down and say, this is where the lacrosse equipment goes. And this is where the dirty laundry clothes will be ready
Yeah,
for your game. And really it's clearly more of a struggle. So I imagine that's where you get called in.
exactly. And that's the other thing that makes the development challenging for kids is that there's a wide range of normal within adults, but there's also a wide range of development with kids. I mean, there are those, you know, fourth graders who act like 40-year-olds.
Right? You never know.
So there's this wide spectrum that there's always going to be a kid in the class that is the king or queen of executive functions.
Mhm.
Ironically, those are usually the children that teachers perceive as being the most intelligent because they know the assignment, they do it, they turn it in. So they're perceived as being the good student, where
Mhm.
in fact, maybe the most intelligent one is the one that's executive functions are growing a little bit more slowly.
Yeah.
And intellectually, they can do it, but they can't get home with all the materials to save a life.
Right. They can't show what they know.
Yep.
Right. Tell us about, I guess, the middle school years. I always think about like the transition from one teacher to, I guess, 9 or 8, however many courses you
Right.
have, and the locker versus just the backpack. Kind of what you've noticed, and maybe
Yeah.
a teenager you've helped, so we can
It's
get
a
a sense of
huge
where it's heading.
transition. Yeah. Because, like you said, you're in a different building, usually. You have different teachers for every class with different expectations, oftentimes different places where they post the homework. So some will put it on the website that the school uses, others have to have their own little special website. Others just write it on the board and never post it outside. Others don't even write it on the board, they just tell you. So every teacher has different expectations, they post their information differently. You may have a class with 0 friends in it, which has never happened before. um, and just physically moving around the school of knowing, do I have time to stop at my locker, go to the bathroom and talk to my friend and get to class on time? They have no perception of that at
Mhm.
all. um, Whereas in grammar school, most all of the executive function components are external. Now it starts to get a little bit more internal. The teachers give less guidance, they give you less information. They may not all be doing it the same way, and you have to have that mental flexibility. Well, in English, she likes it turned in here, but in math, she likes it turned in there. That can be super challenging. And
Mhm.
then, not to mention just all of the growing that takes place. I mean, there's a huge, huge difference between a fourth or fifth grader and a sixth grader. So you've got that going on, which messes with everything that they're doing. So middle school is where you start to see where the breakdowns are. That's where there's often a lot of missing assignments, lack of anticipation. Um, I had one boy who, since I think probably since he went to kindergarten, every single Friday, there's a spelling test. Even I knew there was a spelling test every single Friday, every single week, unless there was no school on a Friday, in which case there was on a Thursday,
Right.
every single solitary time. And every week it was a surprise to him. He'd be like, we got another test Friday. I'm like, you've had another test Friday for the last 3 years. I know, but we have another test. And then they would
Oh,
come in and he'd say, there's no school Friday. There won't be a spelling test. I'm like, yes, there will be. Just that ability to generalize just
never clicked.
never got through his head, never clicked. Seeing those patterns, even when they were directly pointed out, just seeing that progression from time to time. And it also shows up because at that age, with practices, it's more often that parents drop kids off and leave them and then come back so that if they don't have what they need, it's really apparent when you show up for
Yeah.
volleyball and you don't have your knee pads and there's no one there to run home and get them for you.
Yeah.
So things like that. I mean, not knowing the spelling test didn't bother that kid a bit, but you're the one person who's on the bench because they don't have their gear and
That
they
hurt.
can't practice, or you
Right.
show up for your piano lesson and you forgot the music. That makes them feel badly too.
Totally. Or you're letting down the team. I could see that being really
Yeah,
difficult. Right. And again, you're right. A lot of times, they feel a sense of shame around I'm not good enough, right? I'm
yeah,
not smart enough. And it's often again that they just really do need more practice and support doing these, learning these skills. Uh,
right.
it, you know,
Especially, I mean, you can speak to it more than I can, but middle school, they really start getting that concept of what other people are thinking about them and
yes,
how they interpret other people's expressions and their words. And so something that seems very non-consequential to us can be devastating and mess them up for the whole rest of the day. They forgot their knee pads and therefore they're not going to study for their science test.
right. Right.
Yeah,
Right, and their brains are flooded with all the other emotional pieces of fitting in and the
right.
social piece, so it's a lot. It's a lot at once for sure.
It
Um,
is.
yeah. Do you have an example of maybe a teenager, middle school or high school that you've helped, kind of what they came in for and the work you did?
High school kids are fun. Well, middle school and high school, but particularly high school. I always say I never knew I liked high school boys as much as now that they're not living in my house because high school boys tend to be painfully honest. So if we'll spend an entire session mapping out this project that's due in 2 weeks. Every step. What are you doing each day? Blah, blah, couldn't be better. They're on it. I'm going to get an A. This is going to be great. I see them the next week. I'm like, okay, where are you with that project? Didn't do it. I'm like,
Started it.
okay, why did we worked on it. You remember that we worked on it? Yeah, I remember. Why didn't you start on it? Didn't feel like it. Okay. I can work with that. Same situation with a high school girl comes in. Did you do it? It was so unfair. I can't believe that my teacher did this. My friend did that. It's all external. Everybody did something to sabotage their ability to get going with that plan.
Right.
So it's really that's one of the kind of the first digressions that I start seeing with the male female roles of who's who's working hard with it and taking the ownership and just not caring and being
Mhm.
comfortable saying that.
And
Exactly.
an initiation of tasks is an executive functioning skill. Um,
Exactly.
and it is. It's like if you can't even start because, there's probably a million reasons.
Whatever. Right.
You're paralyzed by the anxiety or you're avoidant or you just don't feel like putting in the energy, it's hard to get going, whatever the piece may be. It's hard because then it's more likely that they'll procrastinate because they're again it's a bigger task in their mind versus if they just
Right.
start with something even teeny tiny, it typically is easier for them to do the next step and the next step.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
One story that was a girl who I didn't start working with until after this happened. She was a junior. No, she was a senior applying for colleges and incredibly incredibly bright young woman, an overachiever, good student, was working on a presidential campaign, was the head of the pom poms, was part of the debate club, like just,
All around.
yada, 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 every single thing. She had always wanted to go to Dartmouth and clearly could get into Dartmouth. And that was her goal. She was also, her time management was abysmal. And so she was always behind in things. But because she was so bright, she was also very charming and very cute. So she'd go and she'd say, I'm sorry. I know I'm supposed to give my French presentation today, but I was out campaigning with Dick Durbin and I couldn't make it. So could I do it tomorrow? And the teachers would be, of course, that's fine. So everybody cut her slack all the time. Comes time to make your applications, she's doing it. And of course, she's doing it at night
Ugh.
because, she should be asleep, but she isn't. And she fills out everything. She gets the final stuff for Dartmouth and it was due on whatever day at 11:59. She clicks submit and she gets a flash that says application not accepted, past the deadline.
Oh,
She looks up and it's 12:03.
oh,
So her mother is just like,
beside
ready
herself.
to explode.
Right.
But the young girl was like, don't worry, I'll just call them tomorrow and tell them what happened. And in her mind, that made perfect sense. And in my mind, I'm thinking, Dartmouth is thrilled that there's one less well qualified candidate that they might have to reject.
Right.
Now, it ended well. She was applying early action.
Okay.
So she was admitted, she could reapply, and she was admitted, regular decision. She ended up going. But after that, we worked for the remaining 6 months on knowing how much time she has and how much she has to do. By the time she went to college, she was ready to go.
Wow.
But it took something, I mean, it worked out for her, but it could have just as easily
Mm.
not worked out.
Right. Well, we talk a lot in our practice, with parents about how the more we help as parents, again, at that age, not little kids, we need to, but they
Right.
have to kind of like pull back because sometimes we just do too much for them. And then by the
Yeah.
time they're college age, they actually really don't have all the skills that they should to function
Yeah.
independently. In this case, it was not the parent, it was just that she was so charming and, likable.
Right. And she
And
squeezed
she
by.
was
And
that French teacher, right, giving her an extension, right? That thought, of course. But if it happens across the board,
yeah,
it doesn't really serve the kiddo. So that's really
right.
that's really a kicker when it's 3 minutes over that deadline for your dreams.
Right.
Wow.
But a deadline's a deadline. And as parents, it's just so hard to know because you feel like most of the time you're wrong no matter what you picked. Um, and I think that's just because a lot of these things are very high stakes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Have you worked, Suzanne, with college-aged kids remotely? Tell us a little bit about things that you do
Yeah.
in that
Lots of lots of college age kids because again, everything's different. So whatever they got good at in high school may or may not be working in college. Also, you tend to go to a college that is your interest and your appropriate level.
Mhm.
Whereas in high school, they have different ranges of classes, but during lunch, you can sit with whoever you want. So the woman who was going to Dartmouth, she was going to a school where everybody there is just as smart as her. And she's used to being the smartest one. And now she may not be. And how do you adjust to that? But the biggest part is just what do you do with all that free time? And how do you study when there's only a midterm and a final and nothing else in between to support your grade? You can't wait until the week before the midterm. The teachers are expecting you to do a little bit every single week, but the professors don't tell you that. They think you know that. They
Yeah.
think you know how to be a student because you've done it for 12 years. But this is a whole different way of being a student. And then how do you fit in an appropriate social life? Because
Right.
when people have too much free time, it tends to be sex and drugs and rock and roll. And we need to find some better substitute behaviors for those free time periods.
Right. How do you build a structure for the
Yeah,
first? Right.
right. And how do a lot of the extracurriculars that were so important in their life are either gone or they're at a lower level or less frequency, less intensity. So those things that brought them joy, or particularly for athletes,
Mhm.
they're physically accustomed to working their tail off every day. And then that comes to a screeching halt. and their body's got all this pent up energy and they don't have a practice to go to. So finding ways that they can harness the things that were successful in high school and then build on them to do in a whole different environment,
Right.
which then kind of segues exactly into then what happens with adults. So you've got the obvious ones where suddenly everything that you have done well on for 14, 15, 16, 17 years, if you're good at it, we reward you by making you go do something entirely different. You've been a great student. Now you're going to actually have to be a great psychologist, which is entirely different. And there's no guidebook for it.
Mhm.
And there's not even in every profession or every job you get, there's not even a mentor assigned. So,
Mhm.
how do you transition an assignment notebook to learning what you have to do in your workforce?
Right. Right. And
So, a
deadlines.
lot of the people that I see kind of they come and go at different life stages. I have a lot of people that I have seen on and off whenever there's one of these transitions because it's hard to figure it out.
Right. It's nice that they can go back to you again at each stage,
Yeah,
understanding, like you said, they may have mastered, one executive function challenging in that stage, but it's going to pop up again in another.
right, right.
Can you give us an example of maybe some strategies for adults who struggle with time management? There's always those people, we always joke in our family, like, let's tell him to come at, 10 minutes before the actual time because he's never going to get there on time. But you know,
Right.
whether it's like setting your phone alarm for reminders, or how do you help people with time management who chronically, struggle?
Their time, first we have to realize how complicated time is. Time is massively, we could talk for 3 hours about time. And there's some mysticism to time, and you don't want to take away from that. But the way we have time is completely arbitrary. And there's been I think, in my humble opinion, there's been a big decrease in time management when suddenly everything became digital as opposed to an old fashioned, like around my office that you're not seeing all of. I have analog clocks
Analog clock.
everywhere.
I feel like the kids are hardly taught to read analog clocks
They
these
have no
days.
idea.
It's
They have
crazy.
no idea.
Uh-huh.
And they they don't understand that time isn't base 10 because when they see it just as numbers on the phone, they try to use math. So
Right.
I'll ask somebody, okay, so if you get home from school or from work or from whatever at 6 o'clock and you want to be done by 10, how many hours is that? They'll say 4 because they did math, they subtracted. Great. Okay, so let's say that you go to bed at 10 and you wake up at 6. How many hours of sleep are you getting? And even adults, they'll be like, well, some of them will be like, they want to say 4 and they realize that's not right, but they have no idea how to fix it. Others will argue with me. They'll say, oh, 4. And I'm like, really? Really? Like, you go through your days with 4 hours sleep? And they're, yes, yes, I do. So they don't even understand that it isn't base 10. They don't feel time. They
Right.
can't tell time. They can't calculate time. They can't estimate time. So how can we expect them to
How to
manage
manage it.
time?
Right. That
So
makes
you
sense.
have to start way, way back at the ability to feel time. And so that's kind of one of the things that I like to impress upon parents and teachers, the adults in the room, not only for ourselves, but for the kids. What can we do that is modeling behavior that's going to be able to help them? So if we're stepping all the way back to being able to feel time, analog clocks are great. When I was in school, there were back in the dark ages, there were analog clocks. And when I was bored, I would be sitting there like this, and then I'd be trying to count in my head
Much
a
more time.
minute. No, a minute.
Oh,
And
a
then I'd
minute.
look and see, oh, it was a minute and 5 seconds. Okay, let's see if I can get it better next time. And then I got to where I could feel a minute.
Yes. We do that a lot with kids who are, not understanding how long it's gonna take to do an assignment, and I'll just say,
Right,
just guess, like, is it gonna take 10 minutes? Is it gonna take an hour? And we're
right,
not holding them to it exactly, but like you said, if they're not even budgeting even close to what it's gonna take,
right.
they don't have a
There,
chance.
they don't stand a chance. Um, so analog clocks are good. Referencing time is good. But again, you're giving them a reference that they don't understand. It would be like you asking me, how far is my office from home? And I told it to you in kilometers,
Yes.
you would be like, okay, whatever, you know?
Right.
So when you say to your kids, okay, we're leaving in 5 minutes, okay, whatever.
Right. Do they
So
have
these I love.
Oh,
You can
beautiful.
see 5 minutes. You can see that there's not much time left.
Yes.
So this is so much better than timers. And all the timers do is tell you, oops, I didn't make it in time.
Right. There's no visual.
There's no visual. And then also give them a reference to something that they understand. So if they're watching a TV show and you can say, okay, bedtime is going to be in three more commercials.
Right.
Or if they're playing a game, you know, when you get to this level, that's when you have to stop, period. Give it in something that they can, and then tell them what that actually was. So bedtime is going to be in three more commercials. That's 30 minutes. Okay,
Mhm.
now that was the last commercial. So that means that it's it's time, or we've got 5 minutes until we have to leave for school. That's when this is going to be done.
Right.
So
Right.
that they start getting those visuals and that you are telling them how long it is going to take
Yeah.
so that they can see, like when they're starting the task, oh, you're making your own breakfast. Well, that should take you about a minute. Oh, you're going to set the table. That should really only take you 3 minutes.
Mhm.
That's kind of a segue into the one of the concepts that I think is important for adults. And it's what I call share your story. So our executive function calculations take place in our head. As adults, we are talking to ourselves all day. We ask and answer a ton of questions. We ponder outcomes. Which way should I drive to work today? Do I get a lunch break? What am I going to wear? All of these things. And we keep it in our heads. And to the kids, everything magically happens. Magically, my uniform is clean and on my bed. Magically, my test has been graded and it's been given back to me. Magically, food is in the refrigerator when I'm hungry. They have no idea. They think we're magicians. They think we just, and they're waiting for that. They're waiting for the ability that, oh, I can do this, when that's never going to happen because it isn't magic. So the
Mhm.
more of our self talk that we let out of our mouths, the better. So, kind of just speaking out loud about what's going on. Well, I picked you up from practice. We've got to squeeze in dinner before homework time. I thought that I was going to make chicken, but when I opened the refrigerator, I realized the chicken was bad. So now we're not going to have chicken. But now I had to come up with something new. And in the freezer, there wasn't anything. So we're just getting takeout tonight. Whereas otherwise, they would just see the takeout and think that you just decided to have takeout. Well, no, that was not the case at all.
Right. I have a client I'm working with, and she said, her high school aged son, and she's a real cook, this woman. The high school aged son like opens the refrigerator and says, we're out of milk. And the mom says, I don't drink milk. It's in a
Right.
drawer. I have a grocery list that we've been using for, all 18 years that you
You're all
have.
your life.
And if you want milk, you're old enough that you can write, when it's getting low, write it on the list. I go to the grocery store once a week, every week. I will absolutely buy you milk. But if
Yeah.
not, you're going to start going to the store and getting the milk if you notice it at the last minute because I don't open that drawer for the milk. And all of a sudden, he started to kind of like do that step himself because he wants milk
Yes.
with cereal every morning. And, it's not hard. He's able to do it, but it's like she never narrated before. If something
Right. It was magic.
to the list, and she probably did it when they were growing up more, and she was realizing, oh, this is actually something that they can do. And so I agree, it's like just being able to say the steps that happen.
Yep.
My kids, when it's time for breakfast in the morning, and I have younger kids, one of them will say like, can I have pancakes like from scratch? And some days I'll say sure, and other days I'm like, are you kidding? We have 5 minutes to get out the door. It's a cereal
Right.
morning. So, but you're right. Just trying to say how many minutes does it actually make to take
Yeah.
to make the pancakes? It's a great example that we should sort of narrate more so they start to learn.
Narrate so they see what's going on. And I think it's important to do it for emotions also, to teach some of that self regulation. And you don't have to do it right at the moment. But, so you're driving and somebody cuts you off and the kids are in the car. Then you can say, okay, you know what? That made me really, really mad. And my first instinct was to slam on the horn and scream at that idiot. But I realized that that wouldn't get us to school any quicker. and it might get them really angry. So instead, I've been taking some deep breaths and now I feel okay and I'm going to forget about it. But instead, what they see is somebody cuts them off. The kids thinks, I'm angry about it. And by magic, you just dealt with it. Well, it wasn't magic. You
Right.
experienced, you felt what you felt, you had a strategy, you used the strategy, and now you're moving on.
Right.
So for high emotions, for low emotions, it's they, if we don't share that, they're waiting to have this mystical realization within them that I can produce milk in the refrigerator. I cannot get mad when someone does something maddening, which is false. They're never going to get that. They have to see that, yes, adults get mad,
Right. And the
but we don't always act on it.
emotional
Right.
regulation is a learned skill as well, like exactly what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that share your story is very important.
Tell us about the importance of sleep and kind of how parents can help with.
My favorite topic these days. So, sleep. This is my new hypothesis that I'm going to test over the next 100 years. Is ADD really ADD or is it lack of sleep? So,
Hmm.
executive functions in everybody are reduced when anything within our body isn't right. Our brain's number one job is to keep us alive. And we don't want to inhibit that because that's what keeps us alive. But when your brain feels like something is at risk, it shuts down higher level thinking, the limbic system, that primitive fight or flight, it spurs its head and it takes over, and it should. But the problem is that we're doing things that cause our executive function skills to go down when there is no fight or flight. So, executive function skills are never good when you're tired, when you're hungry, when you're thirsty, when you need the bathroom, when you're stressed, when you're emotional, high or low, when you're sick, when you're in pain. Anytime you're not right, your executive function skills are a little bit down. Many of those are within our control. So, simple things that you help kids with from the beginning is before you sit down to do your homework, have a snack, have something to drink, and go to the bathroom. None of us can concentrate when we need the bathroom. And none of us would ever say, no, you can't go to the bathroom, suck it up and do it. And yet we do that with things like particularly sleeping and eating. When we are short on time, we think we can steal time by not sleeping and not eating. And those are the two worst things you can do for your brain. So
Wow.
kids are not, I find, I ask kids all the time in a non-judgmental way because they don't live with me. How many hours of sleep did you get last night? It is shocking how many are like at 4 or 5. When I tell them that the recommendation for their age group, anybody under high school or high school and under, it's like 8 to 10 or sometimes 12. I don't know a single person that walks through my door that gets 8 hours of sleep a night other than me. Um, we've got a sleep deprived multiple generations, and that's affecting their executive function. A lot of it is there's many reasons. A lot of kids are way overscheduled. They go to school, they've got 3 hours of practices, they get home at 7, they shower, they eat, and they don't even start their homework until 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. So by the time they finish their homework and they wind down, it's 12 or 1. And at best, they go to sleep at 1 and they wake up at 6 or 7 at best. But what typically happens is they go to sleep at 1 or they don't finish their homework because they're engaged on their phone, either during homework or once they go to bed or both. So they're engaged in something that is not only just keeping them up, but the light from it affects your brain. There's so many things that are bad about sleep and light. And so we've got an entire generation of sleep deprived people. And that means that their executive functions are automatically not at their height because that limbic system is saying, hey, you are tired. You need to rest.
Right.
It's the same with skipping meals. Oh, I don't have time to eat dinner. I've got it, or I'm going to eat in the car on the way. And so your brain doesn't get its nutrition.
Right.
Your brain burns a lot of calories. And those are the two things that I think that are really harming people's ability. Maybe they don't really have an executive function problem. They just aren't getting enough sleep and they aren't eating at a regular time.
Right. I think of it like the gas tank. Is the gas tank full?
Yes.
And
Yes.
full, people tend to be able to deal with the driver who cut them off in a calm, relaxed way. But
Yeah,
where people kind of like lose it, kids and adults, is if, like you said, the gas tank is depleted, they didn't get enough sleep, they're hungry,
yeah,
all of those different factors. And, all of a sudden you see them fragment. So
right.
it's such an important kind of last take home message for parents, that especially the parents of the younger kids, but even through high school, if they can instill in their kids a way to honor the importance of
Yes.
sleep,
And and
have limits
and
on
model,
screens, model
yeah,
great
model
behavior.
it themselves. And
Absolutely.
recognize that, the kids are not signing themselves up for 15 activities. Somebody has to write the check.
Yeah.
And so if your child is routinely having only 2 hours of quote unquote free time in
Yeah.
the course of their whole day, that's probably not sustaining good sleep.
Right. No, it totally makes
Yeah.
sense. So as we wind down, I just have one final question. This has
What's
been
that?
incredibly informative. I wanted to know if there's any either apps or tools, resources, tricks for parents, things that they should sort of start implementing in their day-to-day life for themselves or for their kids.
I think the best answer to all of those comments is the best one is the one that works for you. And so for students and then for adults, a good planner. And they're two entirely different kinds of planners. You need a good student planner. Most of the planners that are handed out in school are abysmal. Um, and it would take too long to explain what's going to make a good planner. But clearly, people are welcome to email me and ask for suggestions on stuff like that. But having a good planner, somewhere that you can get stuff out of your head, that good high level frontal lobe shouldn't be weighted down with minutia. If it
Mhm.
can get out of your head and onto a piece of paper, and it gives you that forward thinking and that ability to plan, because you're not just wondering when is the spelling test.
Mhm.
So having a good planner is great.
Does it have to be
Having
a piece of paper type planner? Could it be online? What are your thoughts on that?
there's some apps that are decent. They're decent and they work for kids who have decent skills to begin with.
Okay.
So like you and I could use one on an app because it's missing a couple of components, but we've got that down. For the younger kids who don't have anything down yet, I'd stay away from the apps. Alarms on the phone are great, unless again that's tying them to their phone even more. They still sell alarms that are just alarms. You can go to Walgreens and get a little kitchen timer for $5. There's still clocks that you can sit on your desk for $5. You can find little things like this for nothing. So having available mechanisms to see time that isn't always your phone is really good. Yeah. I think those are the best resources. And then just, constantly reminding yourself. And then when you have to remind others, these are immature brains that are growing. And just because there's one kid in the class who is like a 40-year-old doesn't mean everybody is. Just because one of your children matured early and the other one isn't doesn't mean there's anything wrong. You
Right.
just have to meet everybody at the level that they're at and provide some supports.
Right.
And I always opt for more support. Tell them and help them and show them as often as you can. And when they look at you and they're like, when are you going to quit telling me to put stuff on the grocery list? Well, I'll quit telling you when you do it all the
Right.
time. Yeah. When
Right.
they tell you, when you see they're doing it, then you back off.
Right. And Suzanne, if someone does want to call you for services or contact you,
Yes.
what is the best mode of contacting you?
Probably the easiest way is to go to my website, which is GoStrong, GoStrong.org.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne,
Thank
for your
you.
time, for your expertise.
Oh, I'm so glad you're interested in it. I
Oh,
could talk about it forever, so I appreciate it.
it's always wonderful to talk to you. And everyone who's listening, please check out more episodes of our podcast. Go to copingpartners.com and click on podcast and articles. And as always, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for listening to the Coping Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And check out our podcast page at copingpartners.com.